drinking bourbon or you're drinking the Kool-Aid? We're tearing down the walls of the bourbon BS and exposing the shocking truth behind those age-old myths. Today we're going myth-busting, bourbon style. Get ready to have your mind blown and your perceptions shattered. This is a bourbon rebellion, and we're calling out the lies, the over-exaggerations, and the outdated dogma. Consider this your myth-busting intervention. So today we're going to break past the stereotypical stories about bourbon and kind of look at the light of it all. We're not just busting bourbon myths today, we're shedding light on what bourbon's story really is. And by the end of today's episode, you'll be able to see through the myths and forge your own path about the world of whiskey. So picture this. You're sipping a bourbon, enjoying the complex flavors, when someone drops a bourbon truth bomb that just makes you question everything. Do you really need to spend a fortune on a decent pour? Is Kentucky the only place that matters? Get ready to challenge those assumptions and discover the real story behind America's native spirit. Welcome back, bourbon lovers, to Chasing the Unicorn, your quest for the perfect pour, where we're all about empowering you with the tools to find your ideal unicorn. I'm your host, John Schuster, and our hunt starts now. So today we're going to tame that unicorn with busting out those myths, and I want to start with the first one, the big one. You know, everybody thinks that only bourbon is legit if it's from Kentucky, right? So, you know, real bourbon, it's got to come exclusively from the bluegrass. Real bourbon's got to come exclusively from the bluegrass state, and if it isn't Kentucky, it's not bourbon. So let me break this one down for you. So federal law, if you're unfamiliar, defines bourbon under very strict requirements. And I'm just going to give you kind of what we call the ABCs of this. So it's an ABCDEFG approach, but bottom line is after the time we get through the alphabet, you'll understand the bourbon pretty easily. So this gives us consistency and quality across the United States. And so here's how it is. If you start with A, it's got to be American made. Bourbon has to be produced in the United States and its territories. Can't be produced in anything else. So think Scotch is only made in Scotland. Bourbon is only made in the U.S. B goes for the barrel requirements. It has to be aged in a new charred oak barrel, ensuring it's fresh contact with wood for the flavor and the color development. Now, I did say barrel. Container is the actual specification, but barrel meets that specification. Moving on to C. C is corn. Your mash bill has to be a minimum of 51% corn. So if bourbon is less than that, it's not bourbon. And this also gives us the sweetness that we're used to out of bourbon. Moving on to D, distillation is where D comes into play. And if you're not familiar, bourbon can be distilled up to 160 proof, but it can't go into a container at that. And that's where we go into E for entry proof. So when it goes into the container, that barrel, it has to be 125 proof. So in order to create it, you can go to 160. In order to put it into a barrel, it's got to be 125. And this allows for kind of the optimal engagement with the wood itself. Now moving on to F, it's a finished product. When you bottle it, it has to be bottled at 80 proof or higher, but it can't be anything lower than that. And this actually kind of keeps it safe and it's a legal compliance. And finally, G. G, I think, is the most important piece of this compared to other whiskeys around the world. And when you look at G, it's genuine additives. And so what does that mean? It means that bourbon can't contain anything. Can't have flavor, can't have color. It has to be everything that came from creating the bourbon and putting it into a barrel for aging. Now, you may be going, yeah, but what about finishing, John? Well, finishing is completely different. And oh, by the way, it's not an additive. It's finishing it. That's allowed by the law. But bottom line is if it has additives, they call it whiskey. If it doesn't have additives, we call it bourbon. So we busted up most of the myths just for that first one. But I want you to think about this. Now, it doesn't have to be made in Kentucky, but Kentucky definitely has had a dominance throughout the entire industry. You know, its climate is perfect, more or less. And it's interesting because if you think Kentucky's the only place, I want to give you three different places to think about next. Think about Texas, think about Colorado, think about Oregon. You know, those are just three locations that have gained a huge recognition for some innovative approaches and some great quality bourbons. So for instance, let's talk about Texas, Garrison Brothers. If you're not familiar with them, they are bold, robust flavors. They embrace that Texas hot climate. And what's interesting about that Texas hot climate is that it really accelerates the aging and gives you those deep, rich notes of oak and caramel. So it's hot down there. It's kind of like putting that barrel at the top of the rick house where it's just smoking hot up there. It's going to age quickly and it's going to give you some really great flavors. Now, moving a little more towards the West Coast, let's talk about Westward, right? So Westward's doing something different. They're focusing more on the malt and their pot still techniques. So Westward, they produce a bourbon that's kind of unique in its profile that really highlights more of the artistry and craft distillation process. But the influences of the Pacific Northwest are cooler climates. So it's kind of I wouldn't say like Scotland, but in a way, it's going to give you more of those type of Scottish environments for the aging process. Now, let's kind of go back into the middle. Breckenridge out of Colorado, they're doing something kind of, I don't know, gimmicky or cool, whichever way you want to look at it. But they're utilizing mountain snowmelt water, filtered obviously. But Breckenridge actually is, they're focusing on the regimental terroir, right? So they're looking at, is my water that I'm using flavoring and changing the profile of my bourbon, much like Kentucky does about their limestone. So different aspects, another great bourbon set. Now, those distilleries are kind of giving you a glimpse of how the geography, the climate, and how they actually do business, the craftsmanship, can change bourbon and give you a variety of different things. But you know what? If you like a Kentucky bourbon and you like the style, then that's probably where you're going to want to shop. Maybe look at something like, Indiana, Ohio, places of those natures, because they're in a very similar climate and pretty damn close to Kentucky if you haven't looked at a map. So let's move on to myth number 2. Myth number 2, I think, is every new bourbon users or bourbon drinkers common one, or maybe somebody that really hasn't tried bourbon. All bourbons taste the same. Because of the regulations, there's very strict design of what bourbon is, and more or less they're similar, right? Because they all go into an oak barrel, etc. But think about this. You got variations in mash bill, rye versus wheat, variations in yeast strains, barrel char levels, aging conditions, the proof, right? All of this gives you a huge, huge spectrum of taste. Even within the same distillery, a single barrel expression can be very different than maybe their standard offerings. So here's something to think about as in a good example. Four Roses. They produce 10 unique different recipes using different yeast and mash combinations. Another one is Barrel Craft Spirits. They source and blend whiskeys from multiple distilleries, each adding its own kind of flavor fingerprint if you think about it. But they're all bourbon and they all taste very, very different. So some good ideas to look at. Now, so here's where I'm going to challenge you. Try a little taste test. Find yourself a wheated bourbon, say a Maker's Mark, and compare that with a high rye like a Basil Hayden. And once you've done that, think, are they the same? Do they taste the same? Is their flavor profile similar? Or is this like drastically apples and oranges? But they're all bourbon at that point. So think about that when you're breaking that myth. All right, let's move on to myth number 3. So there's one definitive best bourbon, right? Everybody says, oh, there's a holy grail, the best bottle ever. It's supreme. If you aren't drinking this, you're not drinking bourbon. Okay, great. Except, you know what? My taste buds are a little bit different than yours probably. And when you look at this, taste is absolutely subjective. If you take someone and they love the sweets, right? And you take another person that loves the sours and you say, look, this donut's the best. And they're like, yeah, I don't really care for sweets, so I don't know why you'd say that. Very different. Well, bourbon's no different than that. Some people love their rye, love their spice. Some people love their sweets and their mellows. So they're looking at rye or they're looking at wheat and things like that to really change how we perceive that bourbon itself. Now, one way you can kind of look at this is critic scores, right? Awards are very helpful guides, but even those people have an individual palate. They're not the same. That's why we have multiple people doing it. Otherwise, we just have one person do it and say, yep, that's the best. But we all have a different palate, and here's a great example of this. Think about Blanton's single barrel, right? Versus a Knob Creek single barrel. They're both great bourbons, but the Blantons taste very different than the Knob Creek, not because they're from different distillers, but they are very different bourbons themselves. But they're both great. Lots of fans love them, and lots of fans say, oh, those are the best. And then I'm sure in the comments you can put about 400 other bourbons that are the best. But as you go through this, if you leave off the single barrels, besides the Blantons, obviously, you're going to find that everybody has a different taste profile, and that's what makes it all fun, in my opinion. But with that, think about Blanton's versus Knob Creek. One's fruity, one's oaky, right? Very different. But there's going to be probably 50 of you saying oak and spice, the other 50 saying fruity, and we're going to come to a draw that, guess what, they're both great. But if you really want to test this out, try doing this. Build your own personal flavor map. Identify what sweet, spicy, floral, or oaky notes you enjoy and kind of list that out. Then go and look for, what are the top bourbons with those spices and flavor profiles that you like, and then try them and then see what you think. Which one is the best? Or test somebody's top 5, top 10, if they're reasonable, obviously, and you can get them. If there's something that you can buy in a local liquor store, try them out. See which one you think is the best. All right, that said, let's move on to myth number 4. This one I love. Older is always better, right? So, it must be a 10 or 12-year-old age statement automatically makes it so much better than that 4 or 5-year-old bourbon. Yeah, well, maybe. It depends. And I'll say it this way. Some bourbons peak around age 4 to 8 years, right? While others will, and if they move on, right, the over oak taste that you don't really care for, an imbalance kind of comes in, that kind of stuff. But so you're not going to take those further. But if you look at a 4 to 8 year old bourbon, the distiller probably designed that bourbon to be there for that period of time. So you can't just put a bourbon in a barrel and say, you know what, at 4 years I can pull it out, it's going to be great. And at 10 years it's going to be even better. And at 30 years it's going to be awesome. It doesn't work that way. Bourbons really are, there's a craft to this, and the distillers understand it more than I think most of us, that they can design a bourbon and put it out there and say, this is the year I want it to come out, maybe a little further. But one of the things that you have happen is when those bourbons go a little too long, they end up a little over oaked, right? And you lose the flavor complexities, and it ends up turning out harsh or stringent taste. You get too much of the tannins out of the barrel, something like that. And you can find that in a younger bourbon too, right? So once they find that optimal age, they're going to do certain things to it and make sure it's right there. But if you want to know, is this the best way to go? Try this. Try a blind tasting. Get yourself a 4-year-old bourbon. Get yourself a 10-year-old bourbon. Get yourself, like a 15-year-old bourbon. And try them out. And say, well, is this the best? Is it always older? And I can tell you that what you're going to find is sometimes at the same proof, they're not. Sometimes those 10 years are just as good as that 4 or 5-year-old. I got a great example. I tried a very young bourbon. It was 4 years when I say young, from a local distillery, and I was blown away how good it was. The blender and the master distiller is all the same guy, and he did a great job. And this is J. Rieger here in Kansas City, and their bourbon they just released actually last year, great buy for about $40. And when you try it compared to some of the big brands around that same price, I was blown away that it was great. For my opinion, it was a great sipper and a great mixer. And sometimes your sippers and your mixers aren't the same. But let me give a better example. Elijah Craig Small Batch, right? It's an 8 to 10-year-old blend. Normally outperforms most of those really expensive, really aged statement ones. But then let me throw this at you. New Riff Bottle and Bond. It's 4 years old, and it's a much younger whiskey, but it's really rich and really complex. So 2 bourbons that you could try out and just kind of test that theory yourself if you're willing to bust that. But try a blind mashup. Find a mid-aged bourbon and a long-aged bourbon and let your palate kind of enjoy it and see. Don't look at the labels, so make sure it's blind and then figure out, is it really work or not? All right, moving on to myth number 5. So single barrel is always better than a small batch. Man, if you can't get a single barrel, you're not drinking it right. That's the way it goes, correct? Anyway, single barrel releases definitely are superior in a lot of different ways. And one of the things about that is you get a higher proof, you get a specific taste. But if you want a consistency and you want something that's great regularly, then a small batch might be your jam right there. You got to take a couple barrels, right? You got to put it all together. You get kind of a blended small batch. Single barrel, this barrel might be the best one ever, but you know what? If you're lucky, it's 160 bottles, maybe 240, if it's a younger one or something like that, and then it's gone. You can't duplicate it. But small batches, you can get a whole lot closer and you can get a whole lot more of it, right? So Well, single barrels definitely, they vary widely. Some are really, really good and some are pretty average, right? So sometimes you pick up a single barrel select and you go, yeah, this is my jam. I got a perfect example of this. So about a year or so ago, I was really picking up the Old Forester single barrel, the Blue Label one, and I went to a local bar that I was frequenting out of Virginia. And if you're in Virginia, go to McCormick's. They're awesome. It's out of Richmond. He's got a couple locations, but the bartenders are phenomenal. And so one of the things that they did for me was I spotted it, this Old Forester single barrel, and I said, hey, that's what I want. Go ahead and pour me a pour of that. And so he brought me out the bottle, and it was the Virginia selection from their ABC. And he poured it, and I thought, well, it's not bad. It's pretty good. I got one on my shelf, not from Virginia, but from somewhere else. But I wasn't home. So I was like, I was enjoying it. It was pretty good. And then he says, okay, do you like that? I said, yeah, it's pretty good. He says, okay, great. Let me pour you another one. I said, no, I don't want to pay for another one. He's like, no, I'm going to give you another Old Forester single barrel. And this is our pick. This is the owner and a couple of the bartenders. They go and pick this. He poured that. I pushed the other one from Virginia away. And I said, I don't know why I'm drinking that thing because this is phenomenal. 2 different single barrels, both phenomenal. But now, let's move on to kind of a small batch thought, right? So if I did a small batch, multiple barrels, I'm getting a consistent flavor. So if that single barrel was maybe blended with a couple others and it was a small batch, I could get more barrels of it or more bottles of it. But you get the idea, right? So something to think about. Do you want that small batch? Do you want that single barrel? Single barrels are great selections when you can try them. Sometimes trying them is the only way to get a really good bottle, and other times it's not. So here's one to think about. Four Roses single barrel can be very different barrel to barrel, right? While Four Roses small batch is crafted to be kind of a reliable, consistent taste. So a good way to really check out the difference if you want to see within the same brand and really within the same type of mash bill. All right, moving on to myth number 6. Wheated bourbon, it's always smoother. Whoa, okay. Yeah, I'm going to blow this one out of the water. So if you substitute wheat for rye, you automatically make the bourbon gentler and less spicy. Yeah, rye is typically spicy. Sometimes it's more floral than spicy, and so is wheat. But think about this. A wheated mash bill can create a softer, sweeter note, but the proof, the barrel char, the aging conditions, and all of that affects how smoothness there really is. So here's one to think about. Weller Special Reserve. It's sweet, it's mild, it's a good bourbon, right? Barrel-proof wheated bourbon can still pack a significant punch. So what if I took a wheated bourbon and I gave you Larceny Barrel-Proof C124? That thing's going to be about 124, between 120 and 124, depending on the proof, sometimes 125. And that sucker is going to be hot for most people if you haven't worked your way up to it. But bottom line is I took a wheated bourbon and I make it pretty spicy in the beginning. We can talk about that in another episode on how to avoid that. But bottom line is just because it's wheated doesn't mean it's going to be smooth and subtle. So if you want to bust this myth for yourself, try the same brand of wheated bourbon in different proofs. Larceny is a great example. You can get their barrel proof and you can get their Larceny and try them both. There's roughly about 25 proof between them, sometimes 30, and you can get a really great experience from a very similar mash or same mash bill, but just different proofs. All right, moving on to myth number 7. High proof means it's going to be harsh. Anything above 110 is just automatically way too hot. Yeah, all right. If that's your first drink for the day and you're not a big bourbon drinker, you don't do this on a regular basis or taste it, that's probably going to blow your palate out and you're going to be like, whoa, no thank you. But let me give you a couple ideas. Here's some tips, more or less. If you use proper techniques, small sips, acclimate your palate a little bit, maybe add a little dilution into it, you can find that it really brings out the complexity of those higher proof bourbons. So a lot of enthusiasts really find that a higher proof translates into more robust flavors, right? But harsh if you're on it too quickly. I'll give you an example. So I had a Larceny 124 sitting in the cabinet, and my wife did a blind pour for me. First one of the night. She says, here you go. I know you love this one. Check it out and tell me which one it is. I hit that and I went, wow, that is really up there. It was my first drink of the day. My palate wasn't ready. I didn't really approach it correctly, and it kind of blew out my palate in the beginning, and I was really lost for probably about 30 minutes. Eventually, I warmed up my palate, I brought it back in, and I could start to enjoy all the flavors and the different complexities of that bourbon. But if you want to try this out, check out Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. It consistently gets praise for some, layered caramel and oak, even though it's 120 proof, and just add a couple drops of water. And if it's too hot for you, put the water in there, and you're going to find that you can really kind of open that up a touch. So I'm going to teach you the 3-sip rule. The first one, when you first put that sip on, and when I say a sip, I'm talking tiny, like not even a dime versus, a penny or a quarter. Put a very little bit amount on your mouth, and what you're going to do is acclimate your palate. By acclimating your palate, you're just going to move that all around, and you're going to coat your entire mouth with this thing. Count yourself to about 5-10 seconds or so, and then go ahead and swallow that. But make sure you're breathing out, not breathing in, so you don't get that burn. Your second one, though, you're going to take that same type of sip. You're going to put it in your mouth for, just a brief 3 to 5, and then you're going to analyze the flavors. You're really going to say, oh, wow, what is this? Am I getting caramel? Am I getting spice? What are the things I'm getting? And then the last one, if you have some access to water, then go ahead and put just a touch into it if it's still a little bit too much, and do it all over again. And what you'll find is that water opens it up. Now, don't be surprised, depending on the water, it might change it drastically to something you do or don't like. But if you can go neat in the beginning, go neat. But there's lots of other ways you can go. We can dig into that another time. Ice, mixed drinks, you name it, right? I wouldn't put it in a mixed drink to try it out, but you might add some ice. So, moving on. Let's move on to myth number 8. Filtered bourbon removes all the flavor. Okay, so if you filter it, you get rid of all the flavor, then why is everybody doing it? So normally people believe charcoal or chill filtration just strips out all the good stuff, leaving a dull spirit, right? Well, here's the facts on this. If they don't filter it and get rid of those unwanted particulates and fatty acids, then what you're going to end up with is a bottle that's cloudy. And a cloudy bottle is something you're not going to buy, nor are you going to drink it. But that filtration gets rid of some fatty acids. It really doesn't alter the flavor to the point where most people will notice it. You may notice it in a single barrel that's unfiltered versus a filtered one, just because that single barrel has so much extra stuff at it, right? But one of the things that you may not get out of the single barrel is a good flavor, which is why a lot of people will test those single barrels. But some distillers, they prefer a non-chilled filtration, and the advantage of that is it keeps the mouthfeel intact. And so in non-chilled filtration, it doesn't take all the oils out as much, and you'll find a little less loss of that flavor with a really well-filtered bourbon that's done right, okay? So chilled filtration, this one removes all that haze and particulates, and charcoal removes the impurities. So if you want the unwanted bad flavors, you use charcoal, and if you want the filtration and chilling, then you're going to remove some of the stuff that we really don't want to see in our bottle, right? But bottom line is I think at this point, distillers know what they're doing, and they have managed to figure out the way to get what they want out and leave the stuff that the way they want in. And you know what? We've been drinking it for years and enjoying it, so I think we'll be all right. But I'll give you a couple examples. Jim Beam bourbons. They use chill filtration, right? But a lot of people love Jim Beam products, and they make a great bourbon, in my opinion, for a lot of different ways. Maker's Mark, another one. They use chill filtration, and for them, it retains their signature sweetness and texture. So they're getting a mouthfeel and a texture that a lot of people have been loving for a lot of years. And neither one are going out of business anytime soon. So I think it's working out. But if you want, find yourself a non-chilled filtered, like maybe a Four Roses single barrel, and then add it with a chill filter and see what the difference is. See if you can tell the difference between the mouthfeel and the flavor and things. But try and keep it as close as you can. All right, moving on to myth number 9. Bourbon must be sipped neat to appreciate it. Look, you can do whatever you want, right? But if you're really a bourbon aficionado, you're doing it wrong if you're doing ice, water, or something else. Well, that's not true. And the reason it's not true is for this. You bought it, you enjoy it. Now, I will admit, I am more of a neat person. I prefer to try it in a Glencairn, enjoy it as I go, sip it, nose it, etc. And I really want to appreciate every bit of that. But that doesn't mean that I'm not going to throw a piece of ice into a rocks glass and sip on that on a nice hot summer day, or have a great mixed drink and use a really good bourbon in it, because I want to enjoy all the robust flavors that thing's adding to the mix. But bottom line is, you add drops of water, it enhances flavor. You add ice, it might bring down some of the proof that you're just not ready for the day. A lot of different things can be done. And at the end of the day, you bought it, you enjoy it. So as long as you're enjoying your bourbon, you're doing it fine. Don't listen to those we call whiskey snobs to tell you, oh, you can't do it that way, because you can do it however you want. In fact, I'll give you a great example. A lot of master distillers, they add a splash of water, opens up the flavor. But one you might be kind of, I don't know, I found it interesting when I read about it, was Jimmy Russell. Now, Jimmy Russell's been at it for a long time, right? And if you're not familiar, he's been at it for 70 years, just celebrated his 70th year last year as the master distiller. But he actually seasons it. And when I say seasons it, it depends on the season. When he's drinking one, if it's a hot summer day, he's going to throw some ice in it. When it's a little bit higher proof, he might throw it in a splash of water. He might mix it with a mixed drink and do it however he wants. So if he's enjoying it that way, I think the rest of us can trust that that's probably a good way to go. And bottom line is, enjoy your bourbon how you want to enjoy it, because at the end of the day, it's your bourbon. But I will say this. Try a few experiments. Taste your bourbon neat, right? If it's still not working for you, then try a few drops of water. And if that's still not working for you, then throw an ice cube in there. And when I say ice cube, make sure you're doing the right ice, not that crushed stuff, etc. Do your research, understand which one you're trying to actually use. But when you do this, observe how the aroma and the flavor, they really change as you do each of these steps. In one of the classes I teach, when we add just one drop, possibly two, into just a little bit of bourbon, it's amazing how much the nose will change on certain bourbons. And then the palate will just go from one side to the other. Not hot, but not spicy. It just really changes the way it is. Some bourbons, for my opinion, when we've tried this in these small examples, they have changed in a way I didn't really appreciate. And I went back to neat. All right, folks, we are at our bonus myth number 10. Now, 10 actually leads us into this fine bottle I have next to me, and I'm going to say this. Prohibition era whiskey was always low quality. All right, if you believe that, let me give you some facts here. So the popular narrative is that Prohibition forced distilleries into ruin, right? Produced really rough, kind of terrible whiskey. Nobody really wanted it, but they were so desperate they'd drink it. Well, not true. A handful of distilleries really were kind of the backbone of everything we have today, I think. So they held what's called a medicinal license, and they maintained a quality stock, because in order to have that medicinal license, they had to show that they were doing exceptional bourbon, producing it in the way that the government wanted them to do it. So not all of it was that bathtub gin level scotch or something like that. Hooch, really, not scotch. But one of the things that they did was they stored barrels, right? And they were protected during this time of the Prohibition, where a lot of distillers were going out of business. And because of that, they were able to continue to refine the product and really produce some really good whiskey, not only during Prohibition, but after Prohibition as well. And that leads us to our perfect pour. So today I've got Old Forester 1920, the Prohibition Style. It was released originally in 2016, and it's bottled in at 115 proof. And the mash bill on this is 72% corn, 18% rye, and 10% malted barley. So great selection, in my opinion, from Old Forester. And I like the proof because I'm a higher proof drinker. But let's talk about why this kind of debunks that myth. So Old Forester is it's really a good example, I think, of the quality whiskey that survived Prohibition. Most Prohibition whiskeys were a much higher proof, around the 115 level. And, if you're only getting a pint, you want it a little stronger, right? But they were able to do a great bourbon because Brown-Forman was able to survive this whole thing and be one of those medicinal whiskey legacies. So Old Forester, they were only one of 6 distilleries that was granted that federal license to produce the whiskey for medicinal purposes. And so under the brand of Old Forester, they continued to distill and age whiskey. And that's where we were able to keep that heritage, right, and bring it forward. Most of them they closed. And so these different distilleries that are coming forward after Prohibition, they don't have the original whiskey or the original plans for that whiskey. And so they're kind of making it up again, but they're still making good whiskey if you're enjoying it, right? But what's interesting is I love the story. Medicinal whiskey was prescribed, right? And it was prescribed for things like insomnia, anxiety, and the flu. Man, can you imagine drinking 115 proof when you have the flu? I bet that sucker comes right back at you. But bottom line is that's what they were prescribing it for. And Old Forester became kind of a trusted name during that time. And if you're not familiar with Old Forester, there's a couple interesting facts. So Dr. Brown, when he originally started putting his whiskey at that time, now bourbon, into a bottle, he put it into a bottle and he wanted it clear so you could see the quality of it. And then he put the label on it and then he signed it. By signing it, he gave you a guarantee that this was a good quality bourbon. And by doing that, he kind of perpetuated something that I think most brands do. And they sign theirs, keeping that whole standard alive. But he also did that based on a standard that was set before Prohibition. And if you're not familiar with it, it's called the Bottle and Bond Act. It was brought forward in 1897. And that, not going into too many details, that was a quality and consistency that was required by law to call it a bottle and bond. So with that, this is not a bottle and bond, but that understanding of what's required to get a good bourbon, still there. So what's interesting, though, about this, if you think about the Old Forester 1920, well, it was released in 2016. The basis of it was from Prohibition, right? Now, Prohibition, a lot of the whiskeys were also barrel proof, right? Which is kind of why I think they went to the 115, getting that higher strength in there, and you don't want to dilute it. So the connection between this and the Prohibition is it's a high proof and really brings us forward to what hopefully those in the day were enjoying, which was a really good bourbon. Now, technically it was whiskey back then because we hadn't passed the law yet in 1964, but we're calling it bourbon. So let's talk about this. Now, if you can't see it on camera and you're listening to this, the appearance is really, I think, quite nice. It's a dark amber with hints of copper, and it really looks like it's going to be a good bourbon just from its looks, right? And as you swirl it around and you kind of check out the legs, and we'll give it a second here to pick up its legs, but as you go along, you start to find that it's got a good consistency. Now, let's check out the nose here. And that nose is nice. I really do enjoy this bourbon. So this nose is pretty warm. Definitely, it's got dark fruit, kind of some cherries, definitely a rich caramel, a little bit of vanilla bean. That one's kind of, in my opinion, way in the back. But you get that, while not a toasted bourbon, got that toasted oak smell. A little baking spice, cinnamon and cloves. Bottom line is this got a great nose, in my opinion. Now, when I say great, yeah, there's a lot of bourbons out there that are great. And I'm going to say okay, not bad, or something along those lines if it's a decent nose or not so, so-so. But bottom line of this one is I think the nose has got great aroma, and it's got a lot of complexity that you can really enjoy it. So let's talk about the palate. Well, for a palate, I'm going to have to try this sucker out. Man, yeah, sorry. I'm just enjoying that way too much. So this one definitely full body, right? It's intense, obviously, with 115 proof, but it's still got that dark fruit. It's almost got like, I don't know, dried fig is kind of the thing that I really like, and it's sweet, but with a hint of fruity on the back. But I love the caramel toffee. It's really buttery. It's when I think about it, it's kind of like eating caramel corn, right? You get that smooth, buttery taste on the back end after the caramel corn's gone, and that's where it is. But as I kind of think about it more, I'm getting a little more cinnamon, nutmeg. Yeah. Hold on, I gotta try this again. Oh yeah, yep. A little cinnamon, a little nutmeg, maybe some cloves in there. It's not too spicy, but you can tell there's a spice to it. But the thing I do love is it's not very oaky. I mean, it's got those flavor profiles from the oak, but it's not really giving it to me. I almost get a hint of cocoa, that chocolatey aftertaste, I guess, in the very end, which in my opinion is pretty good. A little bit, almost a bitterness that goes from the sweet down to a bitter. When I say bitter, I'm talking like very, very minute bitter. Dark chocolate kind of thing that after it's been in your mouth and gone for a while. But so let's talk about the finish, though. So if you're not familiar with the finish, right, that's after that third sip, you go, man, is that getting me down in the chest or is it still in my throat? Where is that thing sitting in, and what flavor went with that? So we'll go after the finish here one more time. Wow. The thing I love about the finish is I get that woodsy taste. It's not oaky. It's not that pencil. It's more of that charred wood, kind of that smoky hint. It's good. I like it. But I'll tell you, for me, this is a long and warm finish. I mean, this one gets me all the way down to the middle of the chest. And to me, that's my long finish area, right? For a long finish, it's down into the, right down to the breastbone. That medium finish, yeah, kind of up here where the top button sits, and then if it's short, man, that thing's in my throat. I barely even know where it is. But for this one hits all my boxes. I definitely totally enjoy the 1920. But I would say what I love best about this is the mouthfeel. It's complex, but it's smooth, and at 115 proof, if your palate's ready for that, it's really just a great sipper. Something to enjoy. I mean, you could throw this into a rocks glass with a ice ball and sip on this through the evening and really just have a great complexity of flavors as it goes along. So let me recommend this. I would first start this with neat. If you have some experience with bourbon, try this neat like I did. Put it in a Glencairn. Enjoy all the aromas, all the palate flavors. Just pick up everything you can out of the profile. And one of the things I want to suggest to you is after you pour this, everybody does the swirl, they check it out, they check the legs, and by the way, the legs looked great. I was watching every time I'd take a sip, the legs would be sitting there. But if you let this sit for about 5 minutes or so, one of the advantages of that is the ethanol will start to evaporate, and you're going to get more of those flavor profiles that you've heard of and maybe aren't experiencing. So when you pour it, don't dive right into it. Let it sit for a minute. Swirl it a little bit. Let the ethanol kind of, dissipate a bit, and then come back to it and try it again and see how it is when you're doing it neat. Now, if it's a little too hot, or even if it's not, try water. It's amazing when you take a bourbon that you really enjoy and you put about 2-3 drops of water into it to kind of open it up. The aromas sometimes will come just exploding out like nobody's business. Other times I've had it go flat on me, so it's really kind of an interesting thing. And one of the things that I've done in the past is tried this with a little water, and I think with water it sweetens it just a touch. It opens up those sweeter notes a little bit more, which is kind of good. And there's a lot of science behind that, but anyway. But last one I would say is throw a rocks glass together, put yourself into a large single, hard ice cube, and mellow this out a little bit and see what happens as you enjoy that. Because when you throw the ice on it, it's gonna take the proof down a little bit. You're gonna pick up a lot of those notes that you're already getting, but you're gonna be able to sip on it and just kind of, relax, I guess is the way. So, but bottom line is, I enjoy this. Recommend you pick this up and try it out yourself as well. So let me leave you with this. We've talked about bourbon myths, and I tell you, they're everywhere, right? But one of the things that I definitely recommend is if somebody gives you a statement, right? Oh, X, Y, Z, this is the way it is when it comes to the bourbon world. Challenge that. Not them, but challenge the myth. Try out what they're saying. Like, oh, I'd never drink a good bourbon with water in it. Well, why not? Some of the distillers are doing it because they want to see how it opens up. They want to see how their clients are going to be, appreciating their bourbon. So try it. See how it is. You might find you like it. It's amazing when you do certain different things that you start appreciating that bourbon better or differently in a different way. So always challenge those myths. Don't accept it at face value, no matter who they are. I don't care how experienced they are. Don't accept it. Challenge it yourself. That's why I gave you different examples on how you can challenge the myth busting that I'm giving you. But when you think about all of this, just realize that misconceptions is all over the place, and it doesn't care, if it's a bourbon or if it's a location, from Kentucky being the only place you can get bourbon. Well, yeah, guess what? Originally when the law was written, that's what it said, but that's not the way it is, right? We already know this. But also, don't even believe the labels. When you see a label, challenge that as well. If the label itself says that it's going to be, X, Y, and Z, and it has a certain flavor profile, if they put it on the label, then challenge it. See if it is. Try it and enjoy it. So with that, I just say, stay curious, right? Bourbon is very complex, and it is very diverse. There's no real rules to it. So myths often oversimplify bourbon's rich heritage and its production. And so don't get sucked up into the myths. Explore. And whether it's comparing the regions or the ages, discover is where it's all at. If you're not discovering, then you're not having any fun. And with that, bourbon enthusiasts, that is a wrap on this episode. Now it's your turn to share your bourbon wisdom. So join our conversation on social media using the hashtag #ChasingTheUnicorn. Tell us about your favorite thoughts of this episode. What did you learn? Is there a myth that you already knew and you thought, nope, that's not the answer? Or is there a myth that you learned about? But be sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And you can find us on Spotify, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and Amazon Music. And like I said, connect with us on social media. Just search for Chasing the Unicorn Podcast. And until next time, keep chasing that unicorn. This has been a Drunken Unicorn production, brought to you by folks who love chasing that perfect pour. Maybe we get a little tipsy along the way, but until next time, sip, savor, and enjoy. Cheers.